In 1890, behind a house on the west side of Chicago, four brothers were making bicycle parts by hand in a rented wooden shed. Their father had crossed the ocean from Scotland with a blacksmith's trade, and he had handed that trade down to his sons. Hugh, John, James, and George Armstrong worked the fire in that shed and sold what they made from a small storefront downtown. The bicycle was the machine of the moment in America, and the Armstrong brothers set out to build the parts and the tools that kept it running. The work was ordinary. What the brothers did with it was not. More than a century later, the Armstrong name has all but vanished. The plants have gone quiet. And yet the tools those four brothers taught themselves to forge are still resting in millions of toolboxes across the country. Most of them do not say Armstrong. They say Matco. They say Napa. They say Craftsman. This is the fascinating story of the Armstrong Brothers Tool Company, the Chicago forge that spent 100 years making tools that left the building wearing other companies' names. The turn came in the middle of the 1890s, and it came from a problem on the shop floor. Machinists who cut metal on a lathe used cutting tools that were forged whole, each one a solid piece of expensive steel. When the cutting edge wore down, the entire tool was spent. In 1895, Armstrong introduced a different idea. It was a forged holder, a single sturdy shank that gripped a small replaceable cutting bit. When the bit dulled, a machinist swapped in a new one and kept working. The holder lasted. The savings were real. And for the first time, the Armstrong brothers had made something the whole trade wanted. There was an engineer's mind at work in that shed. A few years earlier, one of the brothers had patented a ratchet drill built around 5 small pawls, arranged to engage a 12-tooth gear in sequence, giving the fine 60-tooth action of a far more expensive mechanism. It was a quiet kind of cleverness, the sort that shows up inside a tool rather than on the outside of it. That instinct to solve the problem underneath the surface would define the company for the next 100 years. By 1900, the brothers had dropped the bicycle line entirely and turned the whole operation over to making tool holders. The money from that one product built a factory that year, and a larger one 5 years after that. In 1905, Armstrong opened a plant of 100,000 square feet on North Francisco Avenue, in the East Garfield Park neighborhood on Chicago's west side. The shed was behind them. The forge was now a business. In 1909, Armstrong added drop-forged wrenches to the catalog, and with that step, the company moved from the machinist's bench into the wider world of hand tools. A drop forge is a brutal, exacting thing. A heated billet of steel is struck between two dies with enormous force, and in that single blow the grain of the metal is packed and aligned into the shape of a wrench. Done well, forging makes a tool that will outlast the man who buys it. Armstrong did it well. The company stamped its tools with a raised arm mark and a simple promise that a tool with the Armstrong name would not be the thing that failed. For decades, that reputation grew in the places where reputations for tools are actually made. Not in advertisements, but in machine shops and railroad yards and factory maintenance departments, where a broken wrench could mean a broken hand. Armstrong built machinists' clamps and set up tools, wrenches and sockets and ratchets, the unglamorous hardware that holds heavy industry together. In 1948, The company moved to a larger home at 5200 West Armstrong Avenue on the northwest side of the city. And in 1974, it opened a second plant far from Chicago in Fayetteville, Arkansas, built around one of the most modern drop forge shops in the world. Through all of it, the company stayed in the family that started it. A grandson of the founding generation, John O. Armstrong, was still president into the early 1970s, more than 80 years after his forebears lit the fire in that shed. The people who ran Armstrong had grown up inside it. That fact matters to what came next, because here is the part of the story that almost no one who used the tools ever knew. Armstrong did not only make tools that said Armstrong. Long before the end, the company had become one of the quiet forges behind the American tool trade. The maker other brands relied on when they needed something built right and built here. An Armstrong socket could leave the plant, travel to another company, and reach a mechanic stamped with an entirely different name. There was a reason the arrangement worked. A tool truck brand or a parts store line did not need to own a forge. It needed a forge it could trust, one that could hold a tolerance and stand behind a lifetime warranty. And Armstrong could do both. So the sockets and the ratchets and the wrenches went out by the thousands, wearing whatever name had ordered them. On the Matco tool truck, the hardline chrome sockets a mechanic bought on credit were for years Armstrong's work, marked only with a small stamp under the Matco name. At the Napa parts counter, the professional line of mechanics' hand tools carried Armstrong forgings. The mechanic who bought a professional-grade tool at a fair price rarely wondered where it had actually been made. The answer, more often than the trade ever advertised, was a plant in Chicago that most of those buyers could not have named. That hidden business is exactly what made the company valuable. And in December of 1994, after 105 years of private ownership by the Armstrong family, it was sold. The buyer was the Danaher Corporation, a conglomerate that had been assembling tool brands the way other companies collect real estate. By the time Danaher acquired Armstrong, it already owned Allen and KD Tools and Matco and a forging operation called Isco that held the contract to make Sears Craftsman Mechanics tools. Armstrong was folded in as Danaher's industrial hand tool division, one more forge in a growing portfolio. What that meant in practice was that the pipeline widened. An Armstrong forging could now flow into the same production system that fed Craftsman, that fed Allen, that fed KD. For a stretch of years in the 2000s, even Cobalt, the house brand sold at Lowe's, was built in this pipeline of Danaher plants alongside the others. A single group of factories in the American Midwest was quietly making the mechanics' tools for a dozen names that presented themselves to the public as rivals. Armstrong sat near the center of it, and almost no customer knew. For a while, this was a story of consolidation, without collapse. The tools were still forged in the United States. The quality still held. Family ownership had given way to corporate ownership, but the steel had not yet changed. Then, Danaher bought Gear Wrench. Gear Wrench was a newer line, known for a clever ratcheting wrench, and it came with something the American plants did not have: large modern production capacity in Taiwan and in China. It was a good product at a lower cost, and Danaher had just paid for the factories to make it in volume. Inside the portfolio, a quiet arithmetic began. The company now owned two ways to make a mechanic's wrench. One was forged in Chicago and Fayetteville by American workers, and it was expensive. The other came from overseas at a fraction of the price. For a time, the two coexisted, but a business does not usually keep paying for two answers to the same question. In 2010, Danaher merged its tool operations with those of Cooper Industries to create a new company, the Apex Tool Group, a joint venture holding more than 30 brands under one roof. Armstrong was in it, so was Gearwrench, so was almost every other name in the pipeline. And then, in February of 2013, Apex was sold again, this time to the private equity firm Bain Capital, in a deal valued at roughly $1.6 billion. A private equity firm buys a company the way a person buys a house that needs work. The plan is to improve what can be improved, to cut what does not earn its keep, and to sell the whole thing in a few years for more than was paid. Inside a portfolio of 30 tool brands, redundancy is not a virtue. It is a line item. And by any spreadsheet, Armstrong had become a redundant line item. Its own sales were shrinking, partly because Gearwrench, sitting in the very same catalogue, was cheaper and easier to stock at the big retailers. The forge in Chicago made a superb wrench. It also made it slowly, and at an American cost, in a market that had spent 2 decades learning to buy on price. The logic that had once made Armstrong valuable, that it could forge tools for everyone, now cut the other way. If the same company already owned a cheaper wrench for every truck and every parts counter, it no longer needed the expensive one. The change moved through the portfolio, one brand at a time. KD Tools, another old American name in the same group, saw its hand tool line wound down first, clearing room for Gearwrench to expand into a full range of mechanics tools. Once that shift began, the American-made tools that had quietly filled so many other catalogues started to thin out and disappear, replaced piece by piece with imported equivalents. Armstrong, the most respected forge of the group, was not the first to go. It was simply one of the last, and its fall was the one the trade felt most. The end arrived without ceremony. In early 2017, word spread through the tool world that Apex was closing down the Armstrong and Allen brands. There was no farewell campaign, no final commemorative set. There was a round of layoffs and then a slow fade. By 2019, the brands were effectively gone. Anyone who went looking for the Armstrong website found a single page. It thanked the visitor for their trust in Armstrong, and then it directed them politely to 3 other Apex brands for the tools they used to buy. For wrenches and sockets, Gearwrench. For pliers and general tools, Crescent. For eyebolts, Campbell, a company that had forged hand tools for well over a century, had been reduced to a redirect. A forge is not a thing that can be paused. The dies, the hammers, the men who know how to run them, the decades of small corrections that live only in a skilled worker's hands, all of it disperses the moment the fire goes out. A brand can be revived with a logo and a supplier. The knowledge that actually made an Armstrong tool cannot be ordered back. When Apex retired the name, it did not simply shelve a trademark. It let go of the one thing in the whole portfolio that could not be bought again at a lower price. It is worth stopping on what a company like this is, beyond its ledger. For most of a century, Armstrong was one of the things a certain kind of Chicago neighborhood was built around. The West Side plants and the Fayetteville Forge drew in men who spent their working lives in front of a drop hammer, learning to read hot steel, taking a raw billet, and sending out a tool that would be trusted with someone's hand and someone's livelihood 1,000 miles away. It was hard, hot, skilled work, and it was steady in a way that work no longer often is. A man could hire on young, retire from the same forge, and know that the wrenches he had made were somewhere out in the country still turning. Years after the plants fell silent, that is still how the former workers talk about the place. Not as a job, but as a craft they were proud to have practiced. On the same forums where mechanics traded old Armstrong sockets, retired Armstrong hands wrote in to say it had been a good company to work for, that the tools had been the best they knew how to make. When word of the shuttering spread, more than one person wrote a version of the same wish, that anyone would buy the old Armstrong factory and light the forge again. No one did. The pattern in this story is an old one, and it is not unique to Armstrong. A family builds something over generations and builds it to last, because their name is on the door and their neighbours are on the floor. Then, the thing they built becomes valuable enough to sell. It passes to a corporation, and then to a larger corporation, and then to a firm whose only relationship to a wrench is the number it earns. Each owner is rational. Each decision makes sense on its own page. And at the end of the chain, a forge that took 100 years to build is closed in an afternoon, not out of malice, but because a cheaper version of the same tool already sits in the same catalogue. What the spreadsheet cannot record is everything that made the tool worth owning in the first place. The judgment of a forge hand, who knew when the steel was right. The stubbornness of 4 brothers who decided that a cutting tool should be built to be repaired rather than replaced. The quiet decision, made and remade for a century, to solve the problem underneath the surface, and to put the company's name on the result, or, just as often, to build the thing so well that it could carry someone else's. Walk the tool aisle of any large retailer now, and the names are mostly the same as they were. Gear Wrench and Crescent still sit on the shelves, passed along from one investment firm to the next. What is missing is not a name. It is the forge that used to stand behind so many of them. That is the strange shape of the Armstrong legacy. The company spent its life making tools that hid its name, and in the end the name is nearly all that is gone. The tools remain. They are in the bottom drawers of tool chests, in body shops and farm sheds and railroad yards, wrenches in the sockets that have already outlived the company that forged them and will likely outlive the men who bought them. Some of them say Matco, some say Napa, some say Craftsman, and some, the ones that were never sent away to wear another name, still carry the raised arm and the single word 4 brothers chose in a rented shed in 1890. Pick one of those up now. It is heavier than it looks. The chrome has gone soft and grey at the corners, where a hand has held it 10,000 times. Turn it over, and there, small and worn but still legible, is the mark of a forge on the west side of Chicago that made half the country's tools, and let the country give the credit to somebody else.